that one. 1, 2, 3. And we're back. This is segment 3 of episode 397 of the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm Richard McColl here in Bogota. My very special guest is Alexander Diamond, and he's in Briceño, Antioquia. I think the first time we've ever had anyone in from Briceño, Antioquia. He's a PhD candidate from the University of Texas at Austin, originally from Portland, Oregon. And we're going to find out what he's been doing for about 2 years in Briceño. So, Alex, can I say Alex?
Yes, please.
So, Alex, welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you for the invitation, Richard. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great, that's fantastic. Now, listen, I mean, you came to my attention some months or years ago now, I can't remember, when I saw a call for sort of contributions to help for a documentary to be filmed in that region, and I saw the pitch, and I threw a little bit of cash at it.
Thank you.
Feeling incredibly generous and benevolent at that moment, because it's not really something I'd do. I don't know why. Something caught my attention.
I'm honored.
Well, there you go. And then I lost your name. And I had to get in touch with the University of Austin, University of Texas at Austin, this sort of sociology department, I think it is,
That's right, yeah.
And they didn't know a lot about it, and then they found you, and then they put me back in touch with you. So it was, and now we're talking. So there you go. But this documentary, that's why we're here. You've been there in Briceño. Tell us how. Let's start with the very basics. How did you decide to do all this research in this very, very rural part of Antioquia, Colombia? I mean, Austin, Portland, Briceño,
So yeah, that's a great question, Richard. And Briceño is indeed a very remote village, but it's also really key to Colombia's peace process. So about 5 years ago, the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, signed this peace agreement that's supposed to put an end to a half-century civil war. And at the time, I was living in Medellin, which is about 5 hours away from Briceño, on some dirt roads and some highways.
But only about 50 miles, you know?
Probably, yeah. As the crow flies, probably right around that. Or I should say that as the parrot flies for context. But yeah, so I was living in Colombia. I'd been living in Colombia for 3 years, got really interested in Colombian politics, and at the same time decided to do a PhD in sociology and propose a research project about Colombia's peace process, but from the perspective of the communities that have really lived the conflict, which in Colombia has been rural areas like Briceño. So Briceño specifically, it took me a little while to come to, but part of the conflict, often identified as a motor of the conflict, is coca, the plant that provides the raw material for cocaine. And part of the peace agreement is a coca substitution program. And Briceño is actually the place in the country where the coca substitution program was launched, the pilot program. So it gets called the Peace Laboratory. And it's actually also the place that hosted the first collaboration between the FARC guerrillas and the Colombian government, which was a humanitarian demining program, taking out landmines. So it's just this really key area for the peace process. And I guess that's how I became aware of it. I visited, it's beautiful, the people are friendly, and here we are.
Yeah. It sounds like the perfect place to study, and if you say it's like a peace laboratory, it isn't overrun with investigators or NGOs or anything. It hasn't become like sort of I don't know, I end up saying the word like sort of poverty safari or something. It's not become that. It's still a very remote town with reasonably low expectations of state involvement.
It's a great question. I mean, so one of my academic questions is like, what is, the entry of the state in a way that, and other institutions, NGOs, like you said, what does that mean to local lives? it has been overrun to some extent, a little less now, with NGOs. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime had an office here
Wow.
for 2 years, 3 years, as part of the substitution program. Investigators, researchers, not that many. Some who've actually come because of me or through me, but some journalists, but people who stay for just a few days or a couple weeks. I mean, nobody has stayed for 2 years the way that I have.
So you've gone totally Antioqueño. 2 years. I mean, that allows you to investigate, I mean, entirely thoroughly, proper ethnographic and observational research. And so you've taken this peace laboratory, and you've got that question you said of sort of the state presence and I guess effectiveness of the state there. Now we're 5 years on from the signing of the peace accord. I mean, you suggested in what you just said that the UNODC, the Office on Drugs and Violent Crime, has gone now.
That's right.
Has it been sort of like being vacated by these entities? What is going on, for example, with the crop substitution, the coca substitution project?
So that's a question that in Briceño is of relevance to the whole country, because this is the first, and this is the furthest, in fact, in Briceño, the furthest that the coca substitution program has advanced. And it's been tough. It's been really tough because this is a municipality where the economy was coca, which is true of a lot of really rural outlying areas in Colombia. And the coca economy brings in armed groups. There's violence behind it, but it's an agricultural economy, kind of like, growing bananas or anything like that. If you see a coca plant, it's almost surprising when you think of sort of the cultural weight of, the white powder of cocaine. It's just light green leaves. But that was the economy. There was a tremendous hope within this village. I arrived here shortly after the substitution program was launched, but the president at the time, Juan Manuel Santos, arrived in a helicopter. He promised the state is coming. Literally, he said that. That's actually the title of an article I'm working on now.
Very good.
There was this tremendous promise and hope that this is a community that suffered a lot from violence between sort of competing the guerrilla group, the FARC, but also right-wing paramilitaries. And there's this hope that now, we're going to have licit economies. The state is going to give all these resources, and just life is going to change completely. There are going to be roads, schools, and I mean, one major thing that we can say is that the substitution program, what was promised has not been lived up to. I mean, there's a few reasons for that, but the change in government to President Duque, who took power in 2018, I'm sure many of your listeners are aware, right-wing Uribista, disciple of a very bellicose, violent ex-president of Colombia, who was not interested in the peace process.
Yeah, of course, he was elected on that phrase almost that he was going to tear the document up into shreds. But so I mean, there's a lot of sort of colliding worlds and economies there in Briceño. So you're very close. I mean, as the crow or parrot, as you said, flies to Medellin, but you say it's dirt roads. So first things first, there's no communication really, and so people can't get their agricultural goods out to market. That's a first complaint. So who is making the money? Well, who earns money on that highly durable and easy, I think, crop at coca fields? And also, you've got the Cauca River and I think gold panning as well. Is there gold deposits around there? So you've got everything. But before we get into that a little bit, the rival groups, you've got the FARC guerrillas. This is, I guess they're, coming in from, you'll have to tell us what kind of year we're looking at with them in the region. And then you've got the paramilitary groups. And I suppose at one point they were probably the Águilas Negras. And I suppose now, if there are a paramilitary group nearby, it's probably the Clan del Golfo, I don't, or what have you. How have we seen this back and forth between different illegal groups there? Did it start with the FARC and then it went into others? Did the FARC then come back?
Yeah, so quick regional history. We're talking about a pretty large extension with few people. Now the population is 8,000 people. And the FARC first arrived in the territory in 1981, more or less, as far as I've been able to tell. People sometimes disagree on dates. And what they found was, the Briceño has like a village center, which is where I live, which is where I am now, that at least had police. But most of the outlying rural areas, which is where most people lived and live now, just really didn't have an authority structure. So when the FARC first arrived, it's kind of interesting how older people, obviously, in the village, talk about them, because there were problems with theft, for example, theft of animals, mules, cows. And there wasn't sort of a state authority there protecting them. So sort of in those early years, the FARC are actually given a lot of legitimacy by local populations. In a mayor in the 1980s, someone who was mayor in the 1980s told me, it was the FARC who kept law and order for me. So there's even an articulation. We think of like an insurgent movement as overthrowing the state, but there's, in some sense, an articulation with at least the local state. The dynamic, this is making it a bit too simple, but the dynamic changes tremendously in the late 1990s, early 2000s, with the entry of paramilitaries linked to the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the AUC. And at the same time that they enter, coca starts spreading through Briceño. People start cultivating coca. And sort of one thing that has become very clear, the paramilitaries in some cases drove the cultivation of coca, but the major factor behind people starting to cultivate coca here was a tremendous drop in the price of coffee. This was a coffee growing region, and I can point to particular families here where a farmer was able to put 12 kids into post-secondary education, cultivating coffee, just producing a large amount of really high quality coffee. It was a stable economy. There are all these sort of global forces behind it. There was something called the International Coffee Agreement, which protected coffee prices until 1989. That goes away. Coffee becomes subject to the global market. And by the end of the 1990s, the price of coffee has just dropped. It's a quarter of what it was before. It's dropped below the cost of production. And when this happens, sort of at the same time, people start bringing coca to Briceño from other areas where they had traveled to work in coca cultivation. And coffee just becomes not an option. I mean, people are literally spending more on fertilizer and the labor to pick it than what they're getting for the coffee they produce. So coca starts spreading like wildfire. The paramilitaries arrive around the same time. They tell people, we'll buy this from you. They give people loans for like fertilizer, stuff like that, to buy seedlings. They start buying coca. They start fighting the FARC. The FARC sort of organize their own buyers. They charge a tax. So suddenly you go from sort of one armed group that's relatively relaxed, it's punishing wrongdoers, it has at least some legitimacy with the local population, to just this period of violence, and local communities are caught in the midst of this violence. At the same time, it's a period of economic prosperity, because paramilitaries are literally bringing helicopters in with bundles of cash. And they're doing it, the police are standing guard from them. They're doing it in articulation with local police and military who are collaborating with them to fight the FARC. And And so the character of village life just changes overnight.
Mm. This kind of I don't know what to say. This parallel. It's not even parallel because they're right together. But the behavior and relationship between the military, the police, and the paramilitaries is so very interesting because it was this week that document was released after 30 odd years, and by the Georgetown, I guess it's or George Washington files that they've got, and they start releasing. I can't remember the name of it, but it shows the general saying, you know, there's no need to. There's no need to attack the paramilitaries as we see them doing our job. You know, there's that kind of thing, and we know that they weren't very much.
This has been an open secret in Colombia for decades.
The document coming out was a pretty big one, and that's, you know, it's good that it's out there for, you know, proper discussion now. But as you see it say, you know, the helicopters come in. There's the military helping out. There's the police helping out. You know, this area is a tug of war. It's economically viable then because of the coca crops. Previously, the coffee, now the coca, and now what we're seeing, of course, is the gold mining too. And isn't there going to be a gold mine struck soon?
That's an open question. I mean, there's so I think that there's a broader point to make about the peace process, which is Colombia's national government has been focused on extraction, whether petroleum. There's a hydroelectric dam here, which is,
we'll get into
that. Also a way of there's also a way of extracting natural resources, but mining. This has been the focus of the national development plan for a long time, in fact, in Colombia. But what we saw in Colombia was that large parts of the country were controlled by guerrilla groups, not just the FARC, but mostly the FARC. And they were preventing resource extraction in areas under their control. So even in the lead up to the peace process, you have people like President Santos, other members of his administration saying, you know, with this peace process, we're going to be able to access all these new oil fields. We're going to be able to mine in new areas. And we're going to finance the peace process through this. Open pit peace, a friend of mine called it, in fact.
Very good.
In a wonderful article. But yeah, so that Briceño is a great example of that because their mining concessions were sold in the 2000s, early 2000s, under the Uribe government. To a Canadian company called Continental Gold. This area had a gold mine in the 1940s called Berlin, run by Canadians, not Germans. It was apparently very productive. There was a major landslide and it shut down. There's huge amounts of gold in this territory, and guerrilla presence just basically prevented this Canadian company from coming in to exploit it. The FARC disarm, peace process comes, and immediately this Canadian company starts sending representatives here
because they still own the plot.
They still own the concessions. Yeah. They don't own the land. They own the subsuelo, the underground earth. Yeah. I talk about these things in Spanish, not English. I'm sure there's.
Me too. I understand exactly what you're saying.
There's actually a correct word for that. But,
I'm sure there is a geological term. But yes, so they own what's beneath, let's say. And so they came back. As soon as the peace accord was signed, they came back. That's amazing.
As soon as the FARC disarmed, immediately.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's an interesting lesson. I mean, and it correlates with, it's not just here, it's not just Briceño. We've seen the rates of deforestation just skyrocket in certain areas of Colombia where the FARC previously prevented that. Yeah. This is not to romanticize what the FARC did, but it's a fact that Colombian elites saw and see the peace process as a way of opening up space for exploiting new resources.
Yeah, I mean, I see it in the they see the peace. The elites have seen the peace in this manner, and they've seen conflict in the same manner. There's always a way, isn't there? whichever way the country goes, these guys are not losing money. It's quite negative but it's what we see, and unfortunately, it's a reality. And I don't want to say it's inherited from anywhere, but it's very much kept between these families and kept between these certain businesses. But I mean, you're in Briceño, and it's way out there, as we said, and you, alongside your PhD thesis, your doctoral thesis, you've been putting together a documentary called An Uncomfortable Peace, and I can hear that's what we're going into with all of these different different angles coming in. The uncomfortable piece is Briceño and what Briceño is living, and all of the different elements. Tell us how the documentary is coming along. I mean, when hopefully will we be able to see it?
Well, we're still filming. The pandemic delayed us a little bit, and then there's some concerns about public order. So we're in a process of filming, but actually it's less than just a snapshot in time. The idea is to follow 3 families through this transition, through this transformation in the territory. So, thinking of it as a project that unfolds over a couple years, actually, I think makes the project more interesting. So I think the hope is to finish filming within a year, and then start editing,
get it out there. And so these 3 families, I know that from what I've read, one of them was a coca growing family who've now substituted and are growing cacao. Another family are selling their crops, and the third I can't remember, and I can't.
So all 3 families had at least some coca.
Okay.
And had an experience of working in that.
And they've all substituted?
So one thing about Briceño has 8,000 people. 2,700 families are in the substitution program.
Wow.
So if you leave out like municipal employees and people who live in even if you don't leave out people who live in the village center, most people are directly connected. Nearly the vast majority of people are directly connected to the substitution program. But yeah, the idea is to focus on their daily lives, their livelihoods, their aspirations for the future, and they each have sort of different projects. One family is engaging in agroecology, organic farming, permaculture, it gets called as well. But very sort of environmental values, and they are commercializing goods themselves, which is in many ways, they sell at these campesino markets, which is a response in many ways to something we haven't mentioned, which is that agricultural economies have just become incredibly difficult as a result of Colombian economic policy over the last 30 years, which gets called neoliberalism, but basically means just destroying protections for smallholding farmers. Most recently, the free trade agreement with the US, and now traditional Colombian crops that were grown in this municipality, like corn and beans. People are attempting to compete with this mass-produced American agricultural goods, and the prices are just way too low. So that's one family's response is sort of attempting to sell sort of these specialized organic goods.
So they sort of end up at small, I would say, when you talk about these campesino markets, there's one down the road from me every 2 weeks here in Bogota, but is it that kind of thing?
It is, yeah. No, it's, and specifically, one every month in Medellin, which is a long journey. And they said they have particular clients. They make wonderful organic coffee.
But it's not enough, is it? I mean, it's not, this doesn't sustain a big family, or?
They're an older couple who've, their kids are adults, and it sustains them, but it's a lot of work, and it's far from easy. And, they grow. I was fortunate enough to live with them for 2 months. They grow and eat organic food. They eat nearly everything they eat, they grow on their farm. So it's not an economy that requires a lot of cash.
Okay.
But that's sort of one model of life. The other two families are families with kids, and that adds another element.
Everything changes with kids. Everything changes. So, but Alex, tell me something though. I mean, we've talked about, you said there's 2,700 families involved in the coca substitution plan, but coca's still grown there, right?
So this is a controversial question. At the time of, no, I don't mind answering. At the time that the program was launched, sort of the reported UN numbers were that there were like 4 hectares left, and 500 something were uprooted, and the 4 that were left were just like abandoned plots. Okay. So it's we can say that nearly everyone joined the program and voluntarily eliminated coca. Since I arrived in the municipality, which was 6 months after the program was launched, and now 3.5 years ago, nearly 4 years ago, people have been talking, based on sort of the government failure to live up to the agreement, people have been talking about replanting. They talk about it all the time. There has been some replanting. It's somewhat limited. It's not reached the extent that it did before, but it seems to me like we're in a moment right now where it is coming up a little bit more. Not like before, where sort of every hillside, you turned and there was, at least in some areas, there was coca. It's more hidden, smaller scale. But people are desperate. There aren't great economic options.
But you wouldn't say that any people are being coerced into cultivating coca once again? No,
there's no coercion. I think previously there may have been some coercion in terms of armed groups did not want people to give up their coca. But it's not clear to me that there was, really ever coercion that you have to plant coca.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll have to move on to Ituango, because, Briceño is there. You've got the Cauca River, and I guess just on the other side of the river is Ituango, right? And even today, Ituango is a flashpoint for what is the post-conflict conflict. It's, I guess Briceño obviously suffers as well from what is going on in Ituango, but being on the other side of the rivers, there is a division there. And of course, you've got the huge hydroelectric plant, Hidro Ituango, which has tangled up many a high-profile politician. We don't want to name names right now, but even presidential candidates and so on. And we don't really even know what's going on. Is it even? I mean, it seems like it was a huge white elephant in some respects. I mean, we're talking about thousands of people displaced for its construction, disappeared people for its construction. So, I mean, could you give us a little bit of a background on Ituango? Because you're right there. You're best located to give us an idea of what is the situation with Ituango.
Sure, yeah. Well, so to begin with, Hidro Ituango, the dam, is the machine house, Casa de Máquinas, is actually in Briceño.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it got called Hidro Ituango, and actually people here have moved. Though the project's been such a disaster, I don't understand why they would want to change the name to Hidro Ituango Briceño or something like that. But the project is over the Cauca River, which is the borderline between Briceño and Ituango. It's between the two municipalities. Ituango, well, maybe I'll talk about the dam project first and then get to Ituango itself, because that adds a whole layer of complexity. But yeah, as you alluded to, the project, it's been in the works for 40 years anyway. And there was tremendous violence behind it, sort of to begin with. You know, in the what's called the area of influence, I think there were 15 massacres in a couple years in the late 1990s. It basically just the area became very strategic. Those were paramilitary massacres. You know, the project itself and some of those specific massacres have been associated with, you said we're not going to name names, but everybody knows the name of Alvaro Uribe, ex-president. That's well documented. But yeah, so specifically in Briceño, right before they're going to start construction, you know, it's the Cauca River Valley was an area of traditional guerrilla strength. Two different fronts, both on the Ituango and the Briceño side. So there was this need to move the guerrillas out of the project zone. You know, they did not support the project. So you have the military enter in force around 2007, and there's just tremendous fighting which took over sort of these valley walls, and specifically the community that the documentary focuses on. And at this time, you know, they pushed the guerrillas up the walls, but the community, what the guerrillas do in response is they put down landmines to stop the military advance. And the community becomes known as the most heavily mined area in Colombia. You know, I'm not sure if that's true or how they established that, but it's true that to this day there are huge areas where there are these signs saying you can't stray off the path because it's mined. So yeah, there's you made a comment before that I thought was very apt about how, you know, we have peace enabling these extractive projects, and previously it was violence. This is an example of that. But that project is really the start of Briceño going from this area that's not of much importance to anyone, just one of many, you know, huge parts of Colombia, these isolated rural areas that have limited, they have had the history of sort of state military presence at times, but very little social investment and very little interest from Bogota or from Medellin or from other centers. That project is the start of this interest within the state, within, you know, there's international investors. This is a huge project. This is Colombia's largest hydroelectric dam. So yeah, it begins with violence that touches the community directly. And you mentioned gold panning. There were all these river-based economies, primarily gold panning and fishing. And as part of building the dam, they basically just displace all the gold panners, which was an economy that there were people who worked just as gold panners, but most people basically they refer to the Cauca River as their patron. I guess patron, boss, something in between that, provider. That when they were short of cash, they could go down and pan for gold. And in the months, you know, when they weren't, you know, Colombia doesn't really have seasons like the US or Europe, but there are rainy seasons, and in the non-planting seasons, drier seasons, those happen to be the seasons that it's also easiest to gold pan. So this is very seasonal. These economies were destroyed by the building of the dam. So that's just sort of another way that it's touched local lives and sort of all throughout the territory. That's one thing that links Briceño and Ituango, which you asked about. So there were tremendous social movements against the dam, but they failed. This was a project that has a lot of money behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it was going to happen, or it was going to happen. When you see the list of names there, they're not letting this not happen. I find it fascinating to make reference, and it's something I've learned over the years being here in Colombia, and especially spending so much time in rural Colombia, is sort of high water season and low water season, and like what you just said now, non-planting season. I mean, it's that's how it goes, isn't it? That's how it is. It's not winter, it's not summer, but it's when the crops will be planted and when they yield and so on. I mean, that's the reality of it. And I mean, and this is what you've taken into account, obviously, in your documentary, that the clips that are there on your website, this is a countryside issue. This is. I mean, we say campesinos. I don't want to ever call them, I don't want to say peasants, but that's the literal translation. But I just say small farmers, smallholder farmers, subsistence farmers almost. I don't know if you have a better term for that. If you're writing, it's kind of hard because as soon as you see, if a Colombian text is translated, it immediately says peasants, and it's like, well, there's a negative connotation to that. So. But
that's something I've thought about a lot and wrestled with a lot, and I think I'm using the word campesino very intentionally.
Yeah.
Now there's a field of peasant studies which I think is actually quite critical and intelligent. So I don't know if the word is being resignified, but I agree with your concern.
Yeah, I do have a concern around it. So and now we know that the Hidro Ituango saga continues, the tragedy as well. There have been all manner of allegations or things proven that money was misspent and so on, and it's been as for everything, some corrupt business practices. And yet Ituango and the area in which you are located now still seem to be as well a flashpoint of violence. I mean, if you read any Colombian newspaper or sort of wire service, we're always seeing stuff about Ituango, or well, not Briceño so much, but I think Ituango or the region. And then I'm just sort of curious about it because wasn't there a huge displacement of families recently up there?
Yeah, just a couple months ago. I think the largest displacement in the history of Antioquia, which is crazy to happen in the peace process era. I don't like the word post-conflict, but for that reason. But
post-accord.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean Ituango has a number of characteristics. Aside from the hydroelectric dam, which has brought a tremendous amount of violence to the region. Ituango is a strategic corridor for drug smuggling up to Urabá, the Gulf of Urabá, which is a port, and it's a port. I think you mentioned the paramilitary group. They're called the Urabeños or the Clan del Golfo, which is the Gulf of Urabá. So there's Ituango sort of becomes this national park. And there's sort of these paths that nobody pays attention to, Parque Nacional Paramillo, these sort of mule paths that just go up to basically through these drug smuggling routes. And there's also access sort of on the other side to Chocó. So it's been always really historically strategic for drug smuggling.
Kind of a crossroads there if you think of the Chocó and then think of the sort of Caribbean and the Urabá. And of course it's a straight line as well, isn't it? If you're going straight up to Urabá. So
that's right, yeah.
Obviously right now the issue being reported is that of the migrants, Haitian, Cuban, and then from all over the rest of the world trying to make their way up through Central America into the United States. So I worry about this because again, you read about it, you think about it, and you talk a lot. Obviously, your work is very linked to the peace process and this peace laboratory, and of course, viewing what's going on with the paramilitaries, viewing what's going on with the guerrillas, both of whom I believe are still very active in the area. How do you see it unfolding? This is a very big question for you. How do you see? Well, let's start with the immediate future, because we can't, obviously, with the virus and everything else, we can't. We live in an era of uncertainty and insecurity. But let's say the next 2 to 5 years. What do you expect to occur in an area like Briceño, Antioquia?
Well, Briceño is it's a very special case because it really has been privileged in the peace process. There is a FARC dissident guerrilla group here that rearmed. I think to some extent I know I need tacit approval in order to be here. But the fact that there aren't or have only been very limited paramilitary presence in this village is the only thing that lets me stay here. And many of the villages around it, like Ituango, have tremendous paramilitary presence and ongoing fighting. I mean, I think Colombia for a long time, centuries even, has sort of these unresolved agrarian conflicts, inequalities, lack of opportunity. And you know what we've seen is that the peace process brought this tremendous hope. And I think Briceño is testament to that. You know, people wanted to get rid of their coca. They wanted, you know, that's not 100% true, but in general, there was this sort of desire for state power to come in, investment, illicit economies, no more of this violence. Rural populations have long been caught in the middle. But, you know, we talk about, you know, one, the failings of programs like the substitution program. We haven't mentioned rural integral reform, which was another part of the peace accords, which was supposed to bring sort of the infrastructure. You talked about the roads that campesinos need to get their products to market. There just aren't great options right now. There isn't the investment that's needed. And then on the other end of it, you know, you have the lure, if you want to call it that, of illicit economies like coca. And then you have these huge extractive mega projects that come in, or even smaller scale. You know, mining is an incredible driver of violence in Colombia, both legal and illegal. You know, is very linked to paramilitarism. So when you ask, you know, what's in the future for Briceño, we mentioned, you know, Briceño is filled with gold. You know, there's this chance of now a Chinese company entering to exploit the mine, to set up mining again. I mean, I worry that would lead to tremendous violence here. I think that's a possibility in the next 2 to 5 years in Briceño. I think that coca spreading again through the territory is a possibility. I hope it doesn't happen. I have to say that also here among many of my friends, you know, there are people with projects to take out their own brand of coffee, for example, and they want to build up like a coffee economy in Briceño. I think there's a potential for them to have success and actually, you know, offer some options for smallholding farmers, and for sort of rural development that actually is for rural people, for rural farmers. You know, it's a very dynamic and changing situation. I think I would be reluctant to sort of make predictions about it. I think, you know, as you well know, there's a presidential election coming up. You know, Colombia has the possibility, after being governed forever by sort of center to right-wing candidates, there's a possibility of a left-wing candidate, Gustavo Petro, who's now leading in the polls. You know, I think that would make a difference. I'm not sure what he would be able to do. But yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question. I have a lot of fear for this region, frankly.
Yeah. I think the fear is enough. I think we again, this uncertainty of what may happen and what could happen. So quickly, 2 final sort of points, questiony points type thing. You've never got into trouble. You've never had, you know, a threat upon your person there, because it is a hot zone.
I mean, it's an interesting question. Yeah. Well, you know, frankly, Richard, you ask that question, and there are probably stories that would be better told not in a public setting, but over a couple of beers in Bogota or Mompox. I will, or if you come to Briceño, you know, I will say that especially when I first came here, I think it was really there were and there still are, but sort of these decisions of, you know, who to talk to, who to help, who to ally yourself with. In these communities, you know, armed groups, and here it's the guerrillas, the FARC dissidents, they're not that separate from the community, and there aren't like necessarily clear lines of this person is in an armed group and this person isn't. And you know, the military here, I will say that I haven't felt much threat at all. When I have thought that I was maybe screwing up, I was worried about the military here. And that situation has improved since I first arrived. I am too.
I'm glad to hear that. I would be, you know, I would be certainly concerned with all groups, but as well the military. Tell me one last thing, and you talked about the elections. When you talk to people, obviously, it's, you know, it is a key conversation. What is your general feeling about you know, the voting pattern there? Will they vote far right, or will they vote left, or what are they looking for?
I think this is a great question. This is a great question actually for a topic that I've become very interested in. Voting in an area like Briceño, and I can speak specifically to Briceño. My suspicion is that this is true all over rural Colombia, and probably in a lot of cities too. It's not necessarily a question of ideology. It is a question of forming relationships with powerful politicians who can then direct resources to you. So I will tell you very specifically and very quickly what's happening in this village right now, because congressional elections are coming up in March, March of 2022. And then presidential elections are May 2023, I think, maybe June 2023.
Next year.
Oh no, 2022, right.
2022, May 2022.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's right. We're getting confused. And then later in 2023, October 2023, are mayoral elections. So what you see in a village like this is moving towards the mayoral elections, you have people forming alliances. Right now in the village, sorry, I find this fascinating. So this may be much more detailed than you were expecting.
Go for it.
Right now in the village, you have 3 different alliances, 3 different groups forming. They're going to support different candidates for the Senate and Cámara, House of Representative elections that are happening in March. They will support their candidates, and they will show their strength by showing how many votes they, quote unquote, deliver, right? And that allows them to establish relationships where later they will call on these people, and I've seen this happen based on the last cycle, for help with resources, to bring resources in. So they show their strength, but they also have to make the right alliance with people who will win. So that begins with the congressional elections. And then for presidential elections, it's actually the same thing. But in presidential elections, it's actually less important that the person win, because the people who are actually going to run for president are important figures in the party and can still help direct resources to a village like Briceño, even if they don't win. So the decision doesn't become ideological. And in fact, I was talking with someone about this last night who said, well, because Colombia will have two elections, 2 vueltas, they call them, right? There's a runoff between the top 2 candidates, assuming nobody gets 50%. So maybe in the runoff, then they can vote conscience. But previously, the idea is that they use these elections to campaign for powerful politicians they may not like at all. And this is literally somebody who's planning a run for political office here, who was telling me this last night, that he does not support the politician. He does not ideologically support the politician he's going to support, but they're going to try to bring in votes for that politician in order to establish a relationship with them, strengthen a relationship with them, and then later use that as a way to, 1, show their strength to gain office, and then 2, eventually try to get resources directed to the municipality. So this is actually how rural politics works on many different levels, and it's extended to the mayoral election, it's not an ideological question.
Not at all. Not at all. It's fascinating. And yes, I've seen this in rural Bolivar and Magdalena. Not at all, because in fact we had elections quite recently in a couple of the towns, but very sadly in the town of Margarita, so the next one over from Montpos, the mayor died of COVID. And so there had to be a special election. And the back and forth between the power brokers. In fact, the election has finished, the person has been nominated, but the power brokers behind the opposition are now appealing the decision. It's just it's going to go on. It's going to go on. But we could talk forever. But I would like to say, I've got one last thing. On your video, you have a guy playing his guitar. This is the final thing. Right at the beginning, he's playing his guitar and he's singing a song about the government and so on else. And he's got a guitar strap on that looks distinctly like a rifle strap. Is it a rifle strap?
No.
No. Okay. It looked to
not
me
at all.
It looked like it was like for a big semi-automatic or something.
I'm willing to share his name. He's a city councilman. His name is Marinillo.
Okay. It's not
he's incredibly talented, really nice guy, smart guy. Yeah.
All right.
Nothing. I'm gonna have to take a look at that footage.
Yeah, do, because then you zoom in on it again, because I was like, what is that? And then you zoomed in on it again, you focused on it, I was like, he's trying to make me look at that in the clip. He's trying to draw attention to it. No, anyway, I digress. Listen, anyone who wants to see the clips, I will put them on the Facebook page and of course on Twitter and so on, but you can go to Alex's website, which is, I've got it here, alexkdiamond.com. Yes?
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a lot of writing there too on.
It's good. I've read a fair bit of it actually in the last few days, and very enjoyable, very easy to understand, which of course is key for what's going on in Colombia. So, listen, I wish you all the best in this project, and of course, more than anything, stay safe out there. And of course, don't get yourself or any of your your collaborators, the people helping you with this research, in trouble, please. That's all I really have to say.
That's the idea. No, thank you very much, Richard, for your kind words, for the invitation, for your time. This has been a very enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, that's the idea. The idea is to have a conversation that's informed and informative to the listeners, and I know they've enjoyed it, because last week's show about leishmaniasis in the context of the Colombia's conflict has been incredibly popular. People do have an appetite for these more kind of offbeat stories. So listen, everyone out there, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been episode 397 of the Colombia Calling podcast. Remember, you can support us for as little as $2 a month on our Patreon page. That's www.patreon.com/Colombia Calling, and ensure our economic viability. That's really the issue here. And thank you again to Alex Diamond, AlexanderKDiamond.com, AlexKDiamond.com, his website. Do check it out, and of course watch the clips and spur him into getting that documentary out sooner. So thank you, Alex, for your time. I've been Richard McColl, and this has been Colombia Calling. Bye-bye.